it's the final swing state poll for the Times by YouGov. And it's concentrating on the 7 states which we think are very much in play and which both the campaigns have been targeting. And we find that Kamala Harris very narrowly wins enough of those states to become America's first female president.
Now, it is just days to go until those elections in America. The polls are on a knife edge. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have been campaigning to sweep up support in the key swing states that will decide the vote. On stage in Nevada last night, Harris rebuked Trump for his controversial comments on women and abortion rights.
So he said on the issue of freedom of choice, reproductive freedom, he said that he will do what he wants because, quote, this is his perspective. He will do it whether the women like it or not. Whether the women like it or not.
Meanwhile, Trump said he's suing CBS News for $10 billion after claiming the network edited out part of Harris's interview on 60 Minutes.
CBS is no good. And in fact, in honor of you, I just sued CBS today because of 60 Minutes. You know why I sued her? Because she was on, and it was called election interference fraud. Now, we don't have to lock them up. They should lose their license, which is worth billions of dollars.
Joining me now on the line is David Charter, who's the Times' US assistant editor, and here in the studio, Greg Swenson, who's chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Greg, I'll come to you in just a moment, but David first, I know you've got a bit of an exclusive that's coming very soon on the Times, which has some fascinating new polling evidence. Just tell us about that.
Yes, it's an exclusive for you, Kathy, actually, because we're publishing it later today. It's the final swing state poll for the Times by YouGov. And it's concentrating on the 7 states which we think are very much in play and which both the campaigns have been targeting. And we find that Kamala Harris very narrowly wins enough of those states to become America's first female president. We looked across the 3 Rust Belt states in the north, which Joe Biden won in 2020, and four states in the south and west, which are in play. And we found that Harris is very narrowly, I should say, and within the margin of error, but nevertheless, it's a more than 50% chance that she wins all 3 of those blue wall states in the Rust Belt. And that's enough to get her back to the White House. We have her winning one of the other states, one of the other swing states as well. I can't give you all the results at the moment because we're coming out with them later online.
Well,
but
that's absolutely fascinating.
Very narrowly, Harris has her nose ahead, according to YouGov polling, which has been in the field for several days in these swing states and has just come back to us.
Well, you heard it here first, an exclusive on Times Radio and later, obviously, in the Times paper. David will be writing that up. But that is Kamala Harris, according to that polling, on a knife edge, wins enough of those 7 swing states to become the first female president of the United States. Let's, David, if you don't mind just hanging on for a minute, but I just want to get some reaction to that from Greg Swenson, who's chairman of Republicans Overseas, listening into your analysis there. Greg, what do you make of that?
Well, I'm kind of surprised because every other poll that I'm seeing is either, Trump by a hair, or there's a couple of polls that have Kamala up in 2 swing states, but the 5 swing states seem to be pretty reliably Trump. But it's moving around a lot. I think some of the polling I really like is from JL Partners. They're always about a week ahead of the curve on Trump moving up. So they were always, because he's been moving up for the last 4 weeks. And so they've been ahead of the game a little bit. If you look at Real Clear, that he's got Real Clear has 5 states for Trump, 2 for Kamala. He's almost a point, 0.9 of a point up nationally, in the swing states, 1.3, and then half a point nationally. So
there's been a bit of suspicion, hasn't there, over some of the polls that Donald Trump has been quoting. So is there a bit of spin?
Both, yeah. I mean, I don't trust any of them. Nate Silver did a piece today in the New York Post And he said he thinks they're really trying to keep it close for the benefit of Vice President Harris, because the campaign has had some missteps. Trump is on a tear, with the McDonald's thing and the garbage truck. He's having a good few weeks. And the Harris campaign, seemed to be in a bit of a panic when they did the whole Hitler fascism thing. It didn't really work. It kind of bounced back a little bit or backfired. So I think, Nate seemed to think that there's bias on both sides. He's not suggesting that the Republican, like Rasmussen, doesn't, overdo it for Trump. But
yeah, because there's a bit of fake news.
I mean, I just don't. It's really hard to buy any of it. I mean, at this point in 2020, Biden was up 7.9 points in the Real Clear, and now Real Clear has Trump up 1.3.
Right. Well, let me bring David back in to just sort of disentangle some of what we've just heard. I mean, Greg, I know you're not a big Trump cheerleader, but nevertheless, David, there's a sort of spin and fake news coming from Trump. But what Greg was saying there is that, the Harris campaign have also been spinning these polls as well.
Yeah, obviously, we're relying on YouGov. I have to say I was a little surprised myself, because our own feeling and intelligence is that Pennsylvania is absolutely 50-50, is absolutely on a knife edge. Yeah. And within our results, the fact that it's actually tipped to Harris very slightly in these results, if it goes the other way, Trump would be president. Whoever wins fundamentally in this election, I'm sure Greg may probably agree with us, whoever wins Pennsylvania is pretty likely to become president. And what we looked at, I would just say one thing, is that when YouGov does their polling, they ask about the likelihood of voting. Are you have you already voted? Are you probably going to vote? May you vote? Or are you definitely not going to vote? So we've taken the results from the results from the likely voters.
Right.
And I think this is where the action is now. It's no good now just getting a general poll of registered voters. You've got to try and drill down into the ones who are taking part in this election.
Right. So
that gives it slightly to Harris. And I would just say one more thing. The Democrats do have, in some of the important states, and I'll give the game away here on the West one that we're giving to Harris, it's Nevada. They have a really good get out the vote operation, especially in Nevada. The unions are really big for them there. Wow. So that's seen as slightly edging it, but only slightly. I mean, it really is close.
To be honest, either result, it would be seismic, wouldn't it? However you read it. Greg, Are you sort of worried if he does or doesn't win, given what happened last time he didn't win? And what happened 2016?
Not really. I mean, and one more thing on the polls. And again, I totally buy the YouGov polls. I mean, why would they be any better or worse than anyone else? But just in Nevada, Emerson's got Harris up 1, Rasmussen has Trump up 2, Susquehanna has Trump up 6. Same day. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just really hard to really take any of it seriously. But the
really
trend,
anything could happen.
The trend is your friend here. And so I think, and one more thing on the polls, David quite rightly mentioned likely voters. There's no sense to look at registered voters. But what the Democrats did really well in the midterms, especially, they did it in 2020, but they also did it in the midterms. And, that's why we didn't have the so-called red wave, is they found unlikely voters. They knock on doors, they ballot harvest. The ballot harvesting thing is new. It only started in 2020.
Explain what ballot harvesting is.
It's where you mail out as many ballots as you possibly can. And so the Democrats mail them to apartment buildings and care homes, and then they go to those apartment buildings and care homes and pick the ballots up.
So if they do the same this time, that could push them over the line.
I think so. And what the Republicans have done smartly is finally embraced it, right? Because we totally ignored it in 2020, still playing catch up in 22. But this time, we're doing the same thing.
Right.
We're probably not doing it as well. And plus, the urban, densely populated areas favor Vice President Harris, and it's a lot easier to ballot harvest in a big apartment building than it is in a ex-urban or rural community. So, I don't. The other thing that we're doing rather well, that Trump is doing, or the campaign is doing, is they're appealing to unlikely voters. The both Joe Rogan episodes, both Trump and J.D. Vance, that's appealing to those, people on the couch that just don't care or they don't vote. And that's really good for the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
To answer your question about, last time, first of all, Trump's not president right now, so he's not sitting in the levers of power and can't really control the apparatus, right? Which is what he tried to do in 2020.
You mean in terms of creating civil disorder, really, from the White House?
Even because he was in a much bigger, powerful position, and also he had, when he tried to convince Mike Pence to not certify, he was in that role. Right now, he's just a private citizen. He's going to be down in Mar-a-Lago. I don't think he'll have that ability to gin up a crowd in Washington, for example. But also, back to the Republicans, what we're doing, they're being much more proactive this time. In 2020, the Republicans were on their heels. They thought they were going to win. And when it happened, it was then they were doing lawsuits. Then you had, Rudy Giuliani and all that.
You mentioned lawsuits. A listener has just messaged in on that very point, saying the US polls are pointless. Trump will either win outright or dispute the results. After weeks of demonstrations and riots and 100 or more legal actions, the US Supreme Court will rule in favour of Trump. The court has a 6-3 Republican bias. Even if 2 Republican-nominated justices honourably abstain, a 4-3 vote would put Trump in and thus end US democracy forever. That's from Peter in Leeds. I mean, he may be exaggerating slightly for comic effect. Yeah. However, we're seeing already this entire election being battled out not at the ballot box, but in court. Trump is suing CBS over these allegations denied by the network that their interview with Kamala Harris was edited. This is going to be played out in the courts, whoever wins.
I think so. And that's why the courts are valuable, and that's why they're in place. The institutions worked in 2020, and I imagine they'll work again. So, unfortunately, it's a litigious society, but also the voting systems are not perfect, and some states do it really well. Florida's a great example. Virginia, and we should keep an eye on Virginia on election night because they'll be one of the first notables to report, and so. But some, like Pennsylvania, it's completely broken. They start counting the mail-in ballots on election night after the polls close. So we're not.
That's crazy. How can that happen?
Because when the Democrats decided they wanted mail-in voting in 2020, they unilaterally caused it or created the idea of mail-in voting with some friendly judges. And that's the problem sometimes with partisan judges or
which doesn't happen
judges.
In the UK.
No, I mean, there's a reason why most of the countries in the EU don't have mail-in voting. But I think...
Well, no, we have mail-in voting, but I was talking about the judges are not partisan in the way that they can be in the States.
And so I think, it's not perfect, right? But I think what will happen is the Republicans are being much more proactive. So we won't have this problem after the election where everybody cries foul. The Republican lawyers are on the ground. There's 1,000 of them, 500 paid, 500 volunteers, poll watching, making sure the voter rolls are clean. I don't understand why the Democrats insisted on having 1,600 non-citizens on the voter rolls in Virginia. So Glenn Youngkin had them removed, and then the Democrats sued to have them put back on. And then they were, and then the Supreme Court said, no, you can take them off. It's against the law and against the Constitution for non-citizens to vote.
I want to go back to David in just a second, but just a final point from you. I mean, do you fear that whatever happens, there will be civil unrest, given what happened last time?
I can't rule it out, right? Because after the 2016 election, you had the Women's March. You had a lot of people took it to the streets. In 2020, they were boarding up buildings in Chicago, New York, and Washington for fear of Trump winning. And it turns out they boarded up for nothing. But and then of course you had January 6th. So I honestly think January 6th was an aberration. It's not typical. We had the higher ground prior to January 6th because Democrats always rioted or protested, and Republicans tended to go back to work, back to church, back to coaching their kids' football team, and so that kind of blew that moral high ground that we had. But
there are those who say actually they see the US on the brink of civil war. There are people who say that in serious ways.
That's just a bit exaggerated. Right. Look, everything's cool, and even if Kamala Harris wins, everything's going to be cool. Especially if we have a Republican Senate.
Yeah, but can I just say that you're an unusually centre ground moderate Republican. But Greg,
don't accuse me of that. I'm not a moderate. I'm very conservative, but I think I'm much
That's like
more
a term of
conservative
abuse,
than
isn't it?
Trump.
Yeah.
Because Trump is his own guy, right?
A maverick.
He's actually quite moderate
Yeah.
in policy, and
Right.
so everybody says, "Oh, he's extreme right." No, he's not. I'm extreme right. I just dress like a moderate.
yeah, and sound like a moderate.
Yeah.
Greg Swenson, thank you very much
Thanks,
for joining
Kathy.
us, Chairman of
Great to be
Republicans
here.
Overseas. I just want to go back for one final word to David Charter, if he's still on the line. Just your reflections on what you've heard from Greg, and just sum this up in the final days of the campaign.
Well, we did ask the question in the poll actually about people's fear of violence, and it's running quite high. I mean, on both sides, it asked if Trump was to win or if Harris was to win. It's well over 50% on both sides fear that there will be at least some violence. It might just be a little, but there is a lot of tension in America, a lot of fear of violence. So we'll just have to see whether it materializes. Probably wouldn't necessarily be in the US Capitol this time, which will be incredibly well locked down, I
Yeah.
imagine, for
Yeah.
January the 6th when they sign off the vote. But it may be in the state capitals, because they all have their own version of signing off the vote when they all meet to ratify the vote, and that'll be in December.
Well, David, it's going to be a fascinating few days and weeks and months. I'm quite envious, actually, of you being in the US to cover all this. It's a journalist's dream, the story. Maybe a politician's nightmare. We'll see. David Charter and Greg Swenson, thank you both very much.